Hello, greetings everyone. Welcome to Asia Clean Energy Forum 2020. This is session 5.2 on COVID and the energy sector policy perspectives. We have an interesting mix of presenters and panelists today, and we're happy to have all of you with us. And to get things started, I'd like to introduce David Elzinga. He's works in the energy sector group in Asian Development Bank's Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. And if you were at the opening plenary yesterday, you got introduced to David, and he will set the scene for us, and then we'll go on to the presentations. So David, take it away, please.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dan, and it's a pleasure to set the scene here today. Now, I think the consideration of policy and how the energy sector can respond to the COVID crisis is a very important question. And as we look at policy and how it can be deployed, I think we first need to start with where are we coming from, or I guess better yet, also where are we going? And there's been a lot of talk around how does the expected stimulus that will come to support the response and the recovery from COVID-19, how can we leverage that to accelerate the clean energy transition? So that's, I think, one of the starting points that we need to make sure that's where we're trying to go. Then that leads very quickly into what are the embedded assumptions in energy planning, and these are based on the overall workings of society, because energy in itself is supporting many aspects of our society, whether that's our health system, which at this point has been very much in the focus, but of course, education, work, industry, these are all parts. So again, when we look at energy policy, there's the direct energy policy when we think, okay, how is renewable energies treated, say, in the merit order of the electricity system, or going even one level higher, are thermal plants considered as generation sources going forward? And will they be coal? Will they be gas? But really, even before that, are the indirect behaviors of society that will affect energy system planning. So prior to COVID, we had many assumptions that were built into this. So we are seeing a greater shift in electrification, whether that's transport or heating. We see that shift has been happening. We've seen trends of urbanization, so moving from rural areas to urban centers. Now that we're in the COVID era and hopefully transitioning very much to the post-COVID era, are we seeing structural changes? So we've seen some obvious changes during this period. One that we've seen a lot are people working from home. Now, that has affected how much energy is needed, and then also where that's being delivered. So now, are we seeing structural changes, or are we going to see a rapid recovery to pre-crisis conditions? I think these are things that are very important to our assumptions on policy and how we can use that to shift to low carbon energy systems. So, and will these changes, so first, will they happen? And secondly, will they be a help or a hindrance for this transition? So the one example I have been considering has been transport. So in one sense, we've seen work from home. And in many cases, in the lockdowns, we've seen a significant reduction in people moving around. So this could mean a lower use of transport infrastructure, lower use of personal vehicles, which have a big impact on air quality and GHG emissions. But then alternatively, as things ramp up, We've seen restrictions on the amount of people that can use public transit. So this could mean a greater use of personal vehicles, which could add to pollution and GHG emissions. So I think there are just a lot of questions, and we need to be challenging our assumptions as we go forward to make sure we make these plans that are appropriate to shift us to low carbon energy systems. And I guess one of the last points I want to make too, and ask for consideration from the speakers and the panelists, where are the easy places going to be in terms of making this transition? We've seen variable renewables have been quite resilient during the crisis, but will there be any grid restriction or disruptions with higher shares? And this could change the sentiment from RE to maybe thermal-based. Biofuels are going to struggle with low oil prices. Low gas prices could make gas more viable, and that could help shift later towards biogas and hydrogen. And then lastly, rural energy systems have been impacted by employment reductions or remittances that have challenged existing business models or identified some fragility, because when it comes to rural electrification or rural energy system, prices are always kept as low as possible. Can these systems be made more resilient? So these are my comments at this stage. I'm very excited to listen to the panelists and the speakers. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you very much, Dan.
All right, thanks, David. Good introduction, and I mean, thinking about social distancing as a design constraint for energy delivery, energy service delivery, transport, in particular buildings. We'll talk more about that. Our first presenter is Liutong Zhang. He's a director at Water Rock Economics based in Hong Kong. He specializes in the power and gas sectors in China and ASEAN. And he'll give us a presentation on the impact of COVID-19 on renewable curtailment and capacity planning in China in the 14th year plan. Very important, the world's largest greenhouse gas emitting country. And Liutong, take it away, please.
Hi everyone. My name is Liutong. I'm from Water Rock Energy. Basically, we are an economic consultancy firms that focus on power and gas sectors in the Greater China and ASEAN regions. In the next 10 minutes, I will very much discuss about the impacts of COVID-19 on renewable curtailments and capacity plannings in China. And before I do that, I would like to just provide some basic backgrounds about the Chinese power sectors. And you can see that from these slides, it very much summarizes the basic supply and demand fundamentals of the Chinese power sectors. And in the past few years, power consumption grew quite strongly, mainly driven by electrifications, expansions of data centers, and also relatively high demand growth in the residential area. And thanks to the relatively high demand growth in the past few years, basically the Chinese power sector has started to rebalance and from the oversupply situation back in 2013 to 2016. And if you look at the key demand drivers, we do see that basically electrifications, expansion of data centers, and high demand growth in the residential sector will likely continue in the medium and long term. And we do foresee that Chinese power consumption will likely to grow at more than 3% in the medium and long term. And this does translate to quite a sizable incremental consumption growth each year. Basically, it's around 300 terawatt hour each year, which is sort of a combined size of Philippines and the Vietnam power markets at the moment. So that means in the medium and long term, China will still need to add a lot of new capacities to meet its incremental power demand growth. Of course, in the near term, there will be COVID-19 that has quite a big negative impact in the demand growth, and we'll discuss that later in the and for you that follow the Chinese power market, you'll probably hear about the renewable curtailments. We have done a lot of studies on renewable curtailments for our clients, and we see that there are three key reasons for the renewable curtailments. The first one is that there's usually a large oversupply in the local power system for the inland provinces in China. And there are other reasons like the lack of flexible capacity in the Chinese grid systems, and the dispatch protocol at the provincial levels in China is also usually very rigid. In the past few years, renewable curtailment in China actually has improved quite a bit, and that's mainly because of the improving market fundamentals. But if we look at the basic fundamentals reasons like the lack of flexible capacity in the grid systems, the rigid dispatch protocol, those has very limited progress in the past few years. And that basically means that, let's say the market fundamentals worsens due to COVID-19, you will very likely see some rebounds in renewable curtailments in the next few years. And I think let's talk about the impacts of COVID-19 in the power sectors in the next few slides. And for these slides, we basically just provide a very quick summary of the latest status of the COVID-19 situations. And it has been largely under control since late March this year, although there is still a lot of fear about a second wave of COVID-19. And just a few days ago, there's a dozen of new cases in Beijing, and Beijing has started some kinds of soft partial lockdown in Beijing. And COVID-19 has quite a big negative impact on the economic growth of China's in Q1 2020. But since the lockdown start to ease since late March, the economic activity has rebounded quite strongly in April and May. But going forward, there is still a lot of uncertainties. There's the Chinese export sector is very weak. There is also a lot of uncertainty about a second wave. So going forward, we do see that there will be the economy will be probably continue to be relatively weak in the near term. And in terms of the impacts of COVID-19 on power consumptions, it reduced power demand growth by 6.5% in Q1 2020. But the demand consumptions growth does vary quite a lot across different provinces. The provinces in coastal areas and central China are most impacted, and the demand reduction is 6 to 18%. But for the inland provinces, actually, quite interestingly, you can see that they still have positive demand growth even in Q1 2020. And most of the wind capacity are actually located in the inland provinces in China. And that does show that basically you wouldn't really expect a sharp rebound in renewable curtailments in the inland provinces in China. And in April, basically demand growth is positive, but it's very low. It's slightly less than 1%. And in the next 1 to 3 years, we expect that demand growth in China will probably continue to be relatively weak, probably more like in 1 to 2% range. And in terms of the impacts of COVID-19 on the generations, I think from the charts, you can clearly see that the one that is impacted the most is basically the coal-fired power generations. For for solar and winds, their generation actually continue to increase, mainly driven by incremental capacity additions back in 2019. And this more or less make economic sense because I mean, in terms of merit order, you see that the short run marginal cost of running a solar and wind farms is very, very low. But for thermal plants, they will still need to pay fuel costs to run the thermal plants. And for the impacts on the power plannings, I think there's at least up to now, there's still a lot of uncertainties on what kinds of new power capacity that China will build in the next 5 to 10 years. In the past few months, there has a lot of debates about whether China should embark on a new rounds of coal capacity expansions. And at least from some of the public announcements, there has been some signs that the central and the provincial governments are easing their restrictions on new coal constructions. So there is a risk that China may again build too many coal units in a short period of time, similar to what happened back in 2010 to 2015 after the massive investments stimulus plans after the global financial crisis in 2009. For solar and wind projects, their capacity will likely continue to expand, but they start to have a lot of pushback from some of the provincial grid companies, and basically it's related to the intermittency issues. There's a lot of concerns about how to maintain the same kinds of power system reliability if they connect more solar and wind capacity into their power systems. And so I think for future power capacity addition, actually the next 5 to 12 months will be actually quite critical for China because there are still debates and they haven't really made up their minds. And one positive development on the new initiative is that the Chinese government has pushed forward a new rounds of ultra high voltage lines constructions, and there's a lot. They will build a few new ultra high voltage lines, and those will help to transmit power from the inland provinces to the load centers in central and coastal areas. So that will help to mitigate renewable curtailments and also help the inland provinces to build more wind and solar capacity in the medium and long term. And I think slide 13, this one will just provide a snapshot on our views on curtailment in Shaanxi. We also had forecasts for other provinces in China. And for a few key takeaways from my presentation, I think the first one is basically we do see that COVID-19 does has quite a big impact on the demand growth in the near term. But in the medium and long term, we expect that demand growth will continue to be at more than 3% and driven by electrifications, expansion of the data centers around China, and also high growth in the residential sector. So that means China will continue to add a lot of new capacity and so right policies to try to provide what kinds of capacity they should add, what the quantity that they should add is quite critical in the coming months. And for renewable investors, basically there are two key risks that they need to watch out, basically curtailment risk and the subsidy delay risk. Yeah, that's all from me. I think we can if the audience are interested in some of the areas, we can discuss more in the panel sessions, or you can send me emails, send your questions to me.
All right, Liutang, thanks very much. Quite interesting, and I mean, certainly the situation in China is quite complicated given the size of the economy and the grid. But the uptick in solar and hydro and wind looks pretty encouraging. So we hope we can see those trends maintained. All right, let's move on to our next presentation. Jennifer Leish is formerly worked for the U.S. Agency for International Development and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the United States. And she's now working as a consultant. And she'll tell us about COVID-19 and the power sector impacts and opportunities in Southeast Asia. Jen, please.
Great, thank you, Dan. And of course, thank you to ADB for having us on this really interesting panel. Hopefully I can add a little bit of Southeast Asia regional perspective to the impacts that COVID-19 has had on the power sector in that region, as well as talk a little bit about some of the opportunities that this has actually provided. So what I'm going to talk about today is actually kind of a broad overview of a much more in-depth paper or publication that just came out this week. This was funded by the Advanced Energy Partnership for Asia, so a partnership between USAID and the US National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And this paper you can find actually online at this URL and also through the ASEF website, and you can download it right there if you want a little bit more detail. So of course, Southeast Asia, just like the rest of the world, has experienced an economic downturn from the pandemic. So what we've seen is countries in the region respond in different ways and in different time intervals. But what we can do is generalize these responses into what I see as about 3 different buckets. And each of those buckets really does impact the power sector in a different way. So we've seen travel restrictions across almost all countries within the region. We've seen some type of quarantine or social distancing rules enacted and put in place. And then of course, as a response to the economic downturn, we've seen some type of economic stimulus measures across every country in the region. And why these are important is because each one of these is going to impact the power sector response as well as recovery in the long term. But something we need to keep in mind is that COVID-19 and the resulting pandemic is really what we would call a compounding threat. So prior to this pandemic, the region already had several vulnerabilities. This is a non-exhaustive list, of course, and trends that are really important to set the stage for what we're seeing in the power sector now. So here I've highlighted some of those that we talk about a little bit more in depth in the paper, but that I think are really important to set the stage. So of course, we know that the region has very rapidly growing energy demand. And what that translates to in some countries are issues between not being able to provide enough supply and issues with reliability. We know that the power sector financial health is not entirely great in some of these places where you have utilities operating in the red, for example, and heavily reliant on subsidies. We have a fossil fuel mix, or a fuel mix that's very heavily reliant on fossil fuels across the region. The region will soon become a net importer of oil and gas. That, of course, also influences the air quality and really heavy air quality burden on cities in the region and greenhouse gas emissions. And then along with all of that is that the sector, well, the countries as well as the power sector are already experiencing very frequent and intense natural disasters, both climate and non-climatic natural disasters, which affects their ability to recover from any type of threat, including a pandemic. So we kind of have all of these things overlaid now with COVID-19. And we can now take a look at the power sector overall in the region and come up with some general trends. So one thing that we know, and of course we just heard, is that there has overall been a decrease in demand, but there's a little bit more subtlety to that decrease in demand. So what we've seen is, of course, a shift from commercial and industrial demand in the power sector towards residential. More people are at home, they're staying at home, there's less economic activity and less commercial activity. So along with that comes a change in the shape of the load curve, as well as what we like to call a perpetual Sunday. So the system operators are experiencing a perpetual Sunday. And this is really well illustrated if you take a look at data from Singapore. So here I'm showing a week in April, comparing that same week in April in 2019 in the black to that same week in April this year, 2020, in the yellow. And so you can see that these load curves are tracking one another up until the day that Singapore implemented its quarantine measures, or what they called their circuit breaker measures. And then you can see this very sudden reduction in demand to essentially what looks like a Sunday. So even though we have those generalizations, of course, those impacts ripple through the entire value chain in different ways. And I think I don't want to go through each of these value chain impacts, but of course you can get more in depth in the paper that I referred to. But these are all very important things to consider as we're talking about what recovery could potentially look like. I do want to highlight air quality and emissions impacts. I think this is really important. You know, right now, all of us would be together in Manila for ASEF. I'm really sorry that we can't be together. But what I did find is a photo of what Manila actually looks like right now, or pretty recently. I've spent quite a bit of time there. I've never actually seen this view, but here this is actually Metro Manila and a view of the mountains. So why does it look like this? It's because there's been a really marked improvement in air quality, and that's been because of reduction in pollutants, because of the reduced transportation and declining power demand, all because of what they call in the Philippines their enhanced community quarantine measures. So likewise, of course, along with a reduction in these visible pollutants, you know, there's of course reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And I think the most important thing to take away from this is that this is very temporary. So as soon as economies begin to open back up, economic growth continues in the region, which it is expected to, these levels will continue to rise and go back to where they were. Of course, I couldn't come to the Asia Clean Energy Forum without talking about the impacts on clean energy in the region. And I think we've heard some similar things that are going on in China. You know, existing renewable energy generation has been pretty resilient to this pandemic, and that's been true across the globe. And that's because renewable energy is usually first in the merit order of dispatch and often contracted by take or pay PPAs. And so it's dispatching more, and demand from other plants is actually going down. And so we actually have an increased penetration of renewable energy happening by default. However, for projects that are in the pipeline, there's been definitely a slowdown in those. There's been some cancellations, but as a whole, you know, there's been supply chain disruptions, regulatory delays, and some other workforce issues that we've definitely seen a slowdown in these projects coming online in the region, though the IEA does expect these will rebound in 2021. As for new projects, I think that's something that we're not quite sure of yet. The low oil and gas prices, you know, they're translating to really low LCOEs in the short term for new oil and gas projects. However, you know, it's going to depend on what happens to those prices and as time goes on, and if those prices recover to pre-pandemic levels. So we'll have to see kind of what happens with investment without any economic stimulus measures that perhaps focus on clean energy deployment. So as we think about recovery from essentially what could be deemed as a disaster, typically in the short term, we think of immediate responses. There's been a lot of immediate response in the region, but how do we begin to move up this recovery curve towards essentially building back better or building back more resilient? And this is where that concept of power sector resilience that we keep hearing about comes in. We define power sector resilience as the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changing conditions, and withstand, respond to, and recover from disruptions in the power sector. And this involves a pretty holistic look, not just at, say, deploying a battery, but how do we plan? How do we enact policies? How do we invest and deploy the solutions? How do we ensure resilience of critical services? And of course, financial resilience, not only of utilities, but also of the customers and the consumers. I want to highlight just very quickly resilient power sector planning. So planning is a very important piece of this, right? Planning is a fundamental exercise that all power systems go through. I'd like to point everyone to the Resilient Energy platform, resilient-energy.org, which is where this top graphic is from. And the Resilient Energy platform actually outlines a handbook and process to walk through in evaluating and identifying threats and vulnerabilities in your power system and identifying solutions. I'd like to point to an example from Lao PDR, where USAID actually partnered with the Ministry of Energy and Mines there to help support developing a power sector resilience strategy. more details in the link, as well as on the Resilient Energy platform. One of the things that came up as part of the power sector resilience strategy was ensuring diversification of generation away from being such a hydro-dependent sector. And that diversification of generation is one important aspect that clean energy can really bring to resilience. So I joined the plenary earlier this week, and there was a poll given to all the participants asking, well, what should our priorities be? Should it be resilience? Should it be decarbonization? Should it be infrastructure investment? And I would like to tell you that I don't think that those are mutually exclusive things. There are certainly ways that clean energy can contribute to enhance resilience of the power system. And that's through diversification for one, that's through distributed resources, which can provide rapid deployment to meet growing needs, but also can help support microgrids for critical services. And of course, energy efficiency, demand side management, really important for reducing peak loads, improving system flexibility, as well as providing kind of some of that financial resilience to consumers and to customers. So what does this all mean? What does a path forward mean? So I think probably what we're all going to talk about today on this panel is that when we think about recovery from COVID-19 and the impacts of COVID-19, is that if we combine clean energy deployment goals with economic stimulus plans, we can hit the sweet spot of job creation, air quality improvements, enhanced resilience, and then of course meet that growing demand in the region that will still continue even after this pandemic is well over. And then of course, we need to think longer term and incorporate resilience into the existing planning processes that utilities and governments are already going through. Looking forward to talking more in the panel.
All right, Jen, thanks very much. It was really interesting, and especially seeing the points about the air quality improvements. I mean, I had been hearing that Manila had much clearer skies with 45% reduction in nitrogen oxides. That's pretty dramatic. And the configuration of, the geographic configuration of the power plants there, I think in the Manila airshed, almost all of that pollutant reduction is due to reduction in transport, and it's not the reduction in the coal-fired power plant output. We'll come back to that point later, especially on air quality as the entry point for the investment. But next, let's go to our third panelist. Bini Suryadi is manager of research in one of the departments at the ASEAN Center for Energy, and he'll give us a talk about the public perspective on the impacts of COVID-19 on energy and climate change in ASEAN. Bini, please.
Thank you very much to Mr. Dan Milson, our moderator, and thank you very much for your kind introduction. And I'd like to thank ADB as well to join me this historical event. COVID-19 is causing a significant impact to a whole part of our life, including the way we conducting, organizing the event. But it's exciting to learn that in the last 3 days that it doesn't stop us in sharing the idea or further discuss the collaboration. And in this opportunity, I would like to share with you all of our finding from the recent survey that we had conducted to gather the public perspective on the impact of the COVID-19 on the energy and the climate change in the Southeast Asia region. This survey was conducted by our project, the ASEAN Climate Change and Energy Project, what is short for ACCEP. And this is a joint project by the ASEAN Center for Energy with the Norwegian Institute and International Affairs under the support from the Norwegian Ministry of the Foreign Affairs. It's considered the first integrated regional project on ASEAN that looked into both issues on the energy and the climate change. As you see in our project logo, it's combined the spirit of the SDG number 7 on the affordable and clean energy, and also SDG number 13 on the climate change. Through this project, we aim to support the ASEAN in improving the coherence of policy between the ASEAN energy and climate, and then contribute to more climate-friendly development in the energy sector. We were particularly interested in finding the COVID-19 impact on energy and climate change nexus in ASEAN region based on the public perspective. And therefore, a short online survey on the impact of the COVID-19 was conducted, inviting general respondents from all backgrounds against a wide general perspective concerning the energy and the climate change. As you may see in this slide, the left figure, basically everyone is agreed this is a serious situation that we have. And its impact on the energy and the climate change is equally egregious. When being asked about how serious the impact of the COVID-19 in energy and climate change, both whether in their own country or in the region, ASEAN region as a whole, that the majority respondents say is somewhat serious or consider it very serious. The same pattern are recognized between the two, with the very serious answer is slightly higher in the ASEAN region than their own country. Transportation, industry, and the commercial are the most impacted sector based on our survey. As you see on the pie chart on the right side, most of the respondents thought that the transportation is about 32%, industry 32% also has the largest impact estimated level of the COVID-19 impact among the other sector, followed by the commercial at 21%. Interestingly, in the finding from the survey about the impact of the outbreak on the sectoral energy consumption is in line with the energy mix in end sector in ASEAN. And the left side, based on the ASEAN total final energy consumption in 2019, the industrial and transportation sector are estimated as the two most energy intensive consumer in the region, which is having a share around 38 and 36% respectively. It is no surprise that the industry and the transportation have been the most impacted sector, especially because of many factories and industry are slowing down their activity and travel restriction happening in the several countries to mitigate the spread of the virus. In terms of the energy, majority of our respondents assume that COVID-19 is affecting fossil fuels the most. The figure is also interestingly similar with the share of the fossil fuel in regional energy mix. Based on our ASEAN energy database system, around 80% of the total primary energy in region supplied by the fossil fuels. However, renewable energy source is also considered to be hit by the COVID-19 according to 16% of our respondents. Some respondents thought that the global pandemic is slowing down the energy transition from the fossil fuels to renewable energy and alternative energy across region due to the disruption in the renewable energy infrastructure and the oil price collapse. This will surely impact the effort of the ASEAN in achieving our aspirational target of having higher share of renewable energy in the energy mix. Today, we are about 14% of renewable energy share in our energy mix. Still long way to go to achieve 23% target of renewable energy share in the energy mix by 2025. Last question in the survey, that perhaps the most exciting one from our perspective, because we found a wide range of the diverse answers. About a total of 58% of those polled agree that human activity during the COVID-19, which is less and then produced less emission due to the reduction of the energy demand of transportation, manufacturing or commercial building and others. However, on the other hand, several contra feedback are also seen in the survey, with 7% answering that COVID-19 will stimulate more greenhouse gas emission to the atmosphere. While with only 2% thought that COVID-19 has no impact whatsoever to the climate, 32% believe that the climate emergency has somewhat become neglected because of this sudden pandemic. About a short-term emission reduction is currently observed in several parts of in the region, as Jen saying with the photo in Manila, that it's expected that the rebound effect might happen once the pandemic is over, producing even more pollution than before the pandemic situation. From this public opinion, we can see that there are indeed a various implications to the energy and environmental sector. So identifying the short-term, near-term, and long-term aftermath are necessary to mitigate the undesirable effect. We could use and should use this moment to mainstream the information about the climate change mitigation into the society, to infuse a more sustainable economy and environmental friendly activity in our daily life. I think regardless external pressure like the current pandemic, the human needs the earth more than the earth needs us. So indeed, we should appreciate what the earth is giving us, and in return, provide a proper policy to protect the environmental that's combating the climate change. Last but not least, opinion matters the most. These are the few examples from the article in the various news media, and then you could see the diverse information that we have. One article said renewable energy will suffer, coal will be benefit. But the other article said coal will suffer, renewable will benefit. We also have another article say the fossil fuel will suffer, renewable will benefit. But another article also saying that the difference, coal will benefit, renewable will suffer. I think it's more become like a politic, whether you are becoming a Democrat or a Republican. So I think in ACE, however, in ACE, we believe that having a right information is very, very crucial for the decision making, for the policy making, especially to recovery. Especially in this challenging time. That's why we established a dedicated page that provides various updated information and analysis on the energy and climate change in ASEAN and related to COVID-19. So the policy makers need to be equipped with the proper information, proper analysis. In this page, you will find the detailed result from our survey, also various analysis that we produce through our Energy Insight. You can also see the collection of the news every ASEAN country from various news media. Then you can see that's how the news is actually impacting or giving the pressure to the situation. So by visiting this page, only you can get a whole picture on what is happening in the Southeast Asia, be it at a regional level or the national level. We also have a policy tracking that provides you the information on various measures and plans from the government on energy and climate change issue responding to this COVID situation. So I will encourage everyone to visit our website at our ACCEPT website. ACE is an intergovernmental organization in ASEAN and is working on all the energy sector, including the energy and climate change nexus. We stand ready to support the region hand in hand with all ASEAN countries, with ADB and all the partners to sail together in this challenging time and build back better. That concludes my presentation, and I shall return back to our moderator, Mr. Dan Nelson. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Benny. Very, very interesting to see the results on that survey work, and especially seeing the impact on the transport and commercial industrial sectors. In the in the opening plenary yesterday, we heard that overall we're making in the clean energy space, we're making good progress in electricity and not so much in transport and not so much in industrial. And we'll touch on these things during the discussion. Right now, I'd like to turn to Robin Hughes for some feedback on the presentation and some views, especially about the urban transport space. Robin.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dan, and thank you for the 3 presentations, very diverse. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the speakers and Dan for moderating. In the urban transport sector, one of my main concerns is that we can keep the clean air visions that we have every day when we go out into our gardens, because we can't go much further else. And I'm worried that as traffic comes back in, particularly in the very heavily polluted urban cities of ASEAN, that we go back to square one. Everybody in COVID-19 says that it should be a science-based solution, not a political one. But I fear that in post-COVID-19 in the transport sector, we are going to be back in the political arena, because the appetite for member countries all over the world is very different. In the emerging markets, they've already started with cleaning air policies, but in Asia, it's very much almost stagnant in some and very, very disruptive in others. However, there are a couple of key things that I think we need to address, and these will have political solutions. Subsidies on fossil fuels is a very major part of the economic scenario in Asia, Jakarta, Manila, Thailand, Bangkok rather. And if we eradicate subsidies, the money that we save will go a long way to paying for the infrastructure that we need to support a clean energy transport environment. However, that's not going to happen overnight. Electric vehicles are not going to suddenly replace every diesel vehicle of whatever age in the transport segment. And therefore, we need support for those technologies which can reduce the impact of spewing diesel tailpipe emissions for the next 10, 15, 20 years. Although OEM manufacturers, the original equipment people, Toyota and everybody else, have said that they will stop making diesel engines and diesel vehicles, that's not going to happen overnight. And you still have to maintain the existing diesel truck and bus populations, particularly, for another 10 to 15 years. They're not going to be replaced overnight through manufacturing capacity or from affordability. The problem with ASEAN is it has a very diverse affordability scenario. So technologies like catalysts, which eradicate particulate matter, which eradicate methane and hydrocarbons, they will even support the impact of adopting liquefied natural gas, LNG, and LPG, while we convert to a totally zero tailpipe emissions. I don't think it'll be zero greenhouse gas, because there will still be CO2 to some extent. But one of the things that we're doing in Manila is we've started already to take a pictorial portfolio of the same locations every day at 3 times a day of the air quality. And we're going to do that until the end of September. And in October, we're going to publish a pictorial analysis of how clean air is affecting the people of Manila. It'll show traffic, it'll show whether you can see the sun on a certain day, which in EDSA you can't very often, even on a clear day above the pollution. So I want to see a real political move to adopting and sustaining the changes that we have, that we can all see, but I want to see something that actually solidifies that, and that people can say, oh, that was a result of COVID. Let's use COVID as an opportunity, not just as something that we have to say, wow, how do we get through that? And we've got through it, but let's get through it with some really positive results. It'll take 5-10 years, of course, but we've got to start now, because even with China locking down again today, the States having increased cases every day, Brazil being an absolute basket case in terms of lack of control, we need to start today, and we need to maintain and sustain what improvements are being gleaned. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks, Robin. Now I'd like to hand over to Jens Jaeger with the Alliance for Rural Electrification. And Jens, just one point on this idea of social distancing as a design constraint on energy planning and just the way we live. I mean, I live in a suburban area of a small town. I feel like I live in the country. And the quarantine measures here in the United States, for me, I've felt very little direct impact. And I wonder, and some of my friends here are asking, you know, are people going to move back to the country?
Yeah.
Jens, please.
Thank you, Dan, for the introduction and question. So a little bit of background here first on the Alliance. So the Alliance for Rural Electrification is a global membership association, having about 150 members worldwide and primarily working in emerging markets. So our overarching aim is to provide energy access for all, and we do so by helping our members achieve that mission. Now, in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, the impact on our members' business has been extremely severe, actually. While the, let's say, pandemic has not struck rural Africa, for example, particularly hard yet, the restrictions imposed as a response to the pandemic has had tremendous impact. So, for example, we have conducted a survey to our members, and we've also worked with other partners to expand the scope of that survey. So the responses are from more than 500 companies, and 75% of those companies said that they will struggle with liquidity in the coming 3 to 4 months because of restrictions related to the pandemic. The primary problem is indeed retaining staff because of lack of liquidity, but that stems from, let's say, other problems such as customer liquidity being severely impacted in very poor areas. The limited ability of sales agents to operate and move around freely, and same with maintenance and operations of systems. So what we've actually done as a response to COVID-19 is we've gathered a lot of actors together, and we have made a call to action, and those actions have now also been acted upon. Now, I want to say before I go into the details of those actions that electricity in rural areas is really an enabler of all other, let's say, development goals. So what has happened now is well, what we're risking is if the energy access sector fails, that also puts in peril all the other SDGs in rural communities. So on that note, what we are proposing is to try to save the energy access companies by creating, first of all, a relief fund. That effort has already been ongoing for some months, and there will be a $100 million, or there is a $100 million energy access relief fund spearheaded by Acumen and CTC in New York. One problem though with that fund is that it's primarily concessional debt, so loans. And so what we're calling for is for the micro and small enterprises in rural areas to also have some kind of grant relief mechanism where they would be able to access grants to retain staff, because otherwise we're looking at probably massive layoffs in the coming months. A second thing is that companies are struggling with liquidity because existing projects have been somewhat stalled. So it's difficult to move equipment to rural areas, for example. So what we are calling for is also reallocation of funds from existing projects to secure liquidity for companies. That could also be reallocated to, for example, electrify rural health facilities. Because the DRE companies, so decentralized energy companies, are in a position where they can quickly help governments respond to COVID-19 by distributing masks or providing quick solutions to electrify health centers. The third thing is a basic recognition of decentralized renewable energy as an essential service in rural areas, because that means that the companies can or the operating agents can move around more freely and maintain grids so that they don't break down, and also sell, for example, solar home systems. Lastly, of course, we are also calling for, let's say, stimulus plans for after the crisis. So how do we enable the sector not just to survive, but also flourish afterwards? And so there, what we are mainly looking at is more from a smart grant facility or results-based financing and guarantees. So that's in a nutshell where we're at. We have, so summarizing, the impact is severe in rural areas, or the companies offering electricity supply to rural areas. While it's not directly from a tremendous amount of people dying, it's more the restrictions imposed to avoid the spread of the virus. So we call upon donors, foundations and philanthropies to help us address the funding gap, especially for the local SMEs, which are probably going to be hit the hardest. On that note, I'd like to just briefly abuse my role in the limelight here to advertise an upcoming event we will have in July, also an online event on, well, exactly relief efforts for decentralized renewable energy companies and this segment of the renewable energy sector. We'll also be having a webinar tomorrow, not clashing with ASIF, on electrifying rural health facilities, because the decentralized renewable energy companies are in a prime position to help address that gap. So with that, I'd like to, well, give the floor to someone else in the panel, and looking forward to a good discussion.
Okay, thank you, Jens. Trying to bear with me here for a minute, folks. I'm trying to get to some of the questions that have come in online. Got a few here. Here's one. As a resident of Manila, the skies are slowly returning to pre-COVID-19 status. So those air pollution, the air quality improvements are temporary and now it's getting worse. I would like to ask if, yeah. Oh, okay, sorry about that. Okay. Okay, sorry for the brief interruption there. At least I'm still learning how to do this virtual forum thing. We've had good presentations and responses so far, and let me get to a couple of the questions that came in from the audience online here. We've seen that there's been a dip in demand as Liu Tong showed in China in particular, and then it's coming back. So here's an interesting point someone made. Solution to the COVID pandemic is plain and simple, but requires increased electricity consumption on a daily basis, using warm to hot water for washing and taking a bath. Steam inhaling for 20 minutes will consume 666 watt hours per session with a 2,000 watt kettle. It worked for me, surely will do for everyone. This sounds like the home ventilator solution here. Anybody want to respond to that in terms of this relates back to that shift to the increase in residential demand. Jen, you want to try?
Sure, I guess I'm not quite sure what the question is, but certainly I think protecting human health from COVID obviously requires an increase in energy usage. Residentially, we already see that. Folks are in their home more, they're utilizing cooling more, especially if they're part of a vulnerable population. They have to keep cool, and they also have to be breathing clean air. So as we think about not only this response, utilizing more electricity, especially at the residential level, which is definitely happening, how do we think about increasing electricity usage in the longer term? Because we also have to think about how do we electrify, for example, vehicles, if we want to see that decrease in criteria pollutants or the improvements in air quality. There's going to be certain increases in electricity usage in different sectors for different reasons. And we have to start thinking about and planning for how we're going to meet that demand. But we want to meet that demand in a way that's not going to exacerbate those existing conditions and air quality issues and potential health implications were there another type of respiratory pandemic.
Okay. Anyone else have any thoughts on that? Liu Tong?
I think it's to me it's more like basically at least for China, there's basically more concerns about the amounts of flexible capacity in the Chinese grids. So very much, let's say, if like what Jane just mentioned, basically the COVID-19 does has an impact on the load profile. So the load in the early evening and late time actually increased quite a lot. And for some provinces that has a lot of solar capacity, basically they actually see the similar duck curve that you usually see in like California or some other developed countries. So because of that, there's more and more concerns that basically there will be, I mean, they can't really connect more solar and wind capacity into the grid because they don't really have sufficient flexible capacity to deal with that issue. Sure, but just because of the duck curve issue, it's not really right to dismiss solar and wind. It's more like there should be some kinds of rethinking about policy incentive to incentivize constructions of flexible capacity. Let's say for bridging fuel, maybe more gas-fired power capacity they will need. And then in the medium long term, there will be need some initiative to provide energy storage and also hydrogens for trying to increase the flexibility of the grid. So from that angle, you'll see that there will be probably more and more debates and discussions from China on how to deal with the need to increase the flexibility in the Chinese power system.
Okay. All right. We got another question here that I think is pretty relevant to ADB as a development bank. As a resident of Manila, the skies are slowly returning to pre-COVID-19 status, sadly. I'd like to ask if divestment from coal by banks will realistically have a significant role in a just transition by the Southeast Asia energy sector during recovery from the pandemic. This definitely hits on the, our topic of the, policy perspective. I mean, my view on this is that this discussion about divestment from coal has all been about climate change. Here in the U.S., we don't have any national climate change legislation, but in the last 10 years, half of the coal-fired power plants have been closed down. And in the next 10 years, most of the rest of them are going to be closed down. And we have legislation for pollution control that's based on public health. So let me frame it that way. I mean, what's the perspective on this in Southeast Asia? Pak Benny, let's hear from you first on that point, please.
Thank you, Dan, for the. I mean, thank you for bringing this part of the discussion. I think everybody knows that, as also I mentioned, that the power mix in ASEAN is heavily reliant on the fossil fuels, and coal is a major part of this. We have seen this figure the last 20 years. We have seen the same figure today. And then, frankly speaking, that we still see that as part of the power development plan in the countries for the next 2 or 3 decades in the region. And it goes to the question that's going to be with the current pandemic situation, the investment on the coal by bank, that whether it will be bringing the impact or whether it will be accelerating transition. This is, I think, it's also a million-dollar question that we have. ASEAN countries heavily relying from the external funding for the finance the coal power plant. So far we have like from China or Japan, and then with this limited funding available on coal, that still that ASEAN heavily relies on coal. And then with the current situation that where everybody is talking that's going to be okay, let's have a coal divestment that can be, because the bank will not finance anymore, and then let's go with the renewable energy. But the question is also to what extent this financial impact can be afforded by the countries. So this is a thing that where the policy makers, I mean, the challenge that we have in ASEAN countries, like whether recovering this will be at the cost of affordable for the countries. So I'm not neglecting the issue of the climate change here, but with the current situation that we have in ASEAN, which heavily relies on fossil fuels, heavily reliant on the finance on the coal, this is the thing that I think this is the thing that need everybody on board. I mean, we need ADB that's really addressing this. We need everyone to really raising this issue together and see that how, because before the renewable energy is still, it's considered, starting to consider it affordable, or in the several countries in ASEAN, but majority is still not to the same playing fields with the existing fossil fuels. So designing a proper policy that's helping the countries to move away, or reconsidering the existing coal that they plan they have in their power development is a very crucial comment. I think that's from me, Dan. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Just very quickly, Dan, I think as we slowly move away from coal, which is inevitable over time, I think this is a golden opportunity to have off-grid energy solutions through renewables, particularly where the EV market is concerned. Because if you go to somewhere like Cebu in the Philippines and you have 2,000 electric tricycles, there's going to be more brownouts during the day than there are now, because you're taking from the grid from a previous unused source. So if you can have off-grid charging and supply of electricity for batteries and other uses, including remote air conditioning and generators that back up power systems, use renewables to develop that particular source of power generation. Don't use the grid wherever, just for the sake of it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Obviously, our mission is to promote rural electrification, but the primary source of that should be off-grid electrification, because it's simply a cheaper solution in many areas, especially when you're far from the main cities. So actually, coming back to the question from the audience, the incumbent technology in rural electrification has been diesel generators. So it's of course not coal, but another fossil fuel source. And I think the development banks play a tremendous role in moving away from that technology to renewable energy sources, such as solar PV with batteries, or small hydro, etc. So there is a very important role for development banks here to especially provide funding for the capital expenditures of such projects, which is typically the challenge, because diesel generators are cheaper in the short term, but much more expensive in the long term, because you have to import fossil fuels, or import the diesel, for example, to the islands in the Philippines. So the role of the development banks here is really to provide a source of funding for the capital expenditures for private companies or for other stakeholders electrifying the communities. And by doing so, they would really help moving away from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. A good example can also be found in Africa with the African Development Bank. I've set up a particular off-grid fund. The World Bank is also doing a lot, and ADB is also doing quite a bit of work on, for example, mini grids in South and Southeast Asia. So the transition is happening, but it could be happening at a much larger scale and faster as well.
Can I just briefly add on the diesel generators? They've generally been at the OEM level changed from diesel to the capacity to run on LPG or LNG, which with the right catalyst gives you a very, very low pollution, certainly 80% less than diesel pollutants. So that generator is a generational change as well.
Well, let me ask on this point on the diesel. And there was a question about coal-fired power and stranded assets, but let me frame it a little bit differently. When we talk about the energy transition, and the need to move away from coal and petroleum fuels in particular, gas. We'll talk about that separately. When we talk about stranded assets, in my opinion, we actually have an opportunity to look again at biomass energy, broadly defined to include converting biomass to something that's like coal, bio-coal, and where you could drop that into an existing coal-fired power plant, but you could effectively zero out the greenhouse gas emissions. You would still have particulate matter, you would still have NOx, you would eliminate most of the sulfur, you would eliminate most of the greenhouse gas emissions. Same for diesel. If we can get to a truly sustainable, renewable diesel, that where we're not competing with agriculture, where we're not using a lot of fertilizer, and I know these are big ifs, but that there's and I heard in the presentation earlier in session 332, that in the island countries, diesel is still going to be part of the mix. It may be backup. Diesel's running on biofuel, but hey, if we get 90% reduction in all the pollutants or the priority pollutants and greenhouse gas reduction, let's deal with the other 10% later on. Jens, this is particularly relevant, I think, in the off-grid sector.
Oh, it's a good point. Especially the solar PV mini grids, they still do use a percentage of, will have a backup diesel. So I think what you're saying is completely true. And what we're seeing is actually some innovations on that point on the generator side. I think that was also mentioned before by Robin. But there are also some innovations where you could use, for example, hydrogen as backup, or ADB has been testing systems where you have, a hybrid between different renewables. So completely taking away the generator, but that has typically been extremely expensive. So I would agree with your point that if we can innovate and reduce the pollution from the generator, then that would also go a long way in reducing emissions. And we are seeing innovations on that point. It's just not moved to the scale where it's penetrated the full market, let's say.
Okay.
I think everybody looks at the fuel and not enough at how you treat the fuel. For instance, if you have the right catalysts have been on vehicles and on power stations and whatever for decades, but only recently have commercial solutions been available operating in the right conditions. And in terms of the treatment of tailpipe emissions from hydrocarbons and from diesel emissions, it's the temperature of the catalyst which has been a stumbling block to making it commercial. There are low temperature catalysts now where you can get rid of 100% PM, you can get rid of 85% NOx, and you can get rid of 35% CO2 and 99% hydrocarbons. They're fairly new, they are well tested. Russia is the largest user of that particular technology at the moment. And of course, it runs the whole of its commercial fleet on diesel. So I think if we invested in the treatment of those fuels until they are planned out, coal, diesel, whatever, then we're going to have a much cleaner tailpipe situation, whether it's tailpipe out of a chimney or out of the back of a bus. We're going to have a cleaner air quality through that transition to a completely zero carbon transport society. I think we should pay attention to the solution, not just the fuel itself.
Sure, it's that full, we got to use everything in the toolbox. Let's see here, a few more. I mean, this here's an interesting question for all of us. What if work from home becomes the new normal for years to come? What if tourism, transport, and commercial do not really recover? Is this likely? Would this help keep greenhouse gas at acceptable levels? I mean, this goes to the heart of conventional pollution control. I used to work in industrial pollution control, hazardous waste management, and it's the old line is that it's all about changing public behavior. And when over the decades that we've been talking about climate change, the last thing we talk about is changing public behavior. Now, we know we're going to have other pandemics. We had SARS, we had MERS, we had H1N1, we saw Ebola 5 years ago. Now we have COVID. COVID's going to mutate. We'll have another sometime in the next 4 or 5 years. We'll have another pandemic. How should this inform what we're doing? I mean, in urban transport, Robin. I mean,
yeah.
I think you touched on this already, right? Or someone did. Our cars are wonderful for social distancing, but they're terrible for traffic congestion. So we can clean up the fuel. We can make the car more sustainable. But if we're shifting, if we're not even making the shift to public transport, or we're not making that shift to non-motorized transport, what are our options? I mean, bicycles are great, but when it's raining and during the winter, if you're having snow, it's it's not very fun to ride a bike. But Robin, let's hear from you, and then maybe Benny.
I think it's a function of the number of vehicles on the road, and I'll use Manila and Thailand, where I have most experience in. They're political solutions. The best will in the world is not going to say to somebody, "Oh, you can't drive to work," because they don't want to get onto a filthy public transport bus, jeepney, three-wheeler, or whatever. Coding doesn't work where you stop people going into the city on a certain day. Congestion, like in London, it works for those that can afford it, but those that can't afford it suffer, or they buy a second car in the coding situation. This certainly is the case where you have such a difference between those that have and those that have not in the economic arena. So if you're going to have less cars on the road, and they will be gasoline and diesel, then you are certainly saving on your fuel subsidies, which I hark back to. I'm sorry, but it's a bit of a thing I'm really focused on at the moment. Use that money to create better roads. The amount of investment that's going into projects in ASEAN, particularly for what I consider to be absolutely white elephant transport schemes, a train from Clark to the center of Manila that has 375,000 passengers a day on it, but they're not doing anything to the pedestrian highway below it. So everybody's going to get down on the pavement and then trip over a completely broken pavement. And there's no plan in all the cities in Manila to improve the roads while they're building the train. I just don't know why people don't take the whole of the scenario into play. Manila is changing the lane structure of EDSA post-COVID, where the buses, instead of being on the inside lane, are now going on the outside lane. So that's going to have jaywalkers running across to try and get on the bus. There are 2- and 3-wheelers on the middle lane and cars on the inside lane. All that will mean is that everybody crosses lanes for convenience. There's no lane discipline in the emerging markets of Asia. Put sticks along the street to stop people crossing lanes, fine. In the end, they'll knock them down. There aren't enough police to enforce these changes. I don't think it's a problem that post-COVID is going to have a ready answer for. It's going to evolve over the next 2 to 3 years, by which time, as Dan says, we'll have another pandemic and we won't be back to square one. Car pollution is not the biggest polluter on the planet. It's truck and bus, partly through the fuel they use and partly through the age of the vehicles. Replacing vehicles after 20 years is only valid if the person who owns the old vehicle can afford a new one. There are some imaginative finance schemes, but it still comes back to, can I afford it? And the government either has to subsidize, not subsidize, rather, invest more in infrastructure and suffer the pains while that's going. The best transport network in the whole of Asia at the moment is Bangkok. It has 500 kilometers of overhead tollway. It has 500 kilometers of underground subway. There's 300 kilometers of overhead train. And yet there's still a traffic jam in Sukhumvit during the rush hour because of volume. That's all. Yep. So you're not going to solve it overnight, but you have to invest in solutions which work 20 years down the road.
Yeah, okay. Benny, any thoughts?
Thank you, Dan. I think as Robin outlined, that's most emission or the energy consumption, it's from transport sector, it's coming from the freight. But just sharing the perspective that we have, I think for the last, we have been working from home for the last 4 months, and then it's quite a hectic. I mean, it's quite stressed that you're working from home. It's become no longer 8 hours a day, but it's almost 20 hours, 24 hours a day when you work. But the point that I raised is this is maybe premature when I say it's conclusion, but we see that the productivity remain the same or somehow is being increased. So there's a lot of things that we see. I mean, so we see a lot of sector is actually can be running or being implemented without relying on this transportation sector. So the in that point, I see that maybe we will see the future of mobility is no mobility at all, and in the context of passenger. So maybe it goes into the freight, or maybe you will travel or drive when you are going for the holidays. But with the push that we have in the current situation is actually really a good simulation process that how much we actually can design or can have a new scheme so that all that I say is all the useless, if I say the useless oil that we spend for the transportation, for me, like traveling to the office, like in Jakarta, you travel to the office, that's 1 hour, 1.5 hours a day in the morning, and then return 1.5 hours also in the evening. This is something that can be saved and invested. That's productive thing that's maybe. So this is I think is, again this how is policies being designed to go to build back better is very crucial in this case.
Okay, thanks. We're at our official time limit here, so I do want to wrap up, but maybe let's get one last word in from Jennifer, please.
A last word pertaining to the question, or more generally. You know, I'm not sure any of us know what's going to happen. That's kind of where looking at different scenarios as we think about planning becomes really important. So are people going to be spending more time at home for the next 3 or 4 years? Perhaps. And what is that going to mean at the distribution level? So that's going to have a lot of impacts at the distribution level, some of which we're already seeing. What's that going to do to demand? But more generally, I think as we think through planning, especially resilience planning, we have to consider multiple scenarios and the risk associated with those, right? We go through a process of looking at potential threats, their impacts, and the risk to the system associated with that. And then we go through a planning process that looks at those that are the highest probability and thinks about how to adapt and respond in those situations. And so I hope that is at least what some folks are taking away from this, is that we really have to start thinking longer term from a resilience perspective in terms of providing, reliable, sustainable, and affordable power to everybody in the region. That's for the power sector, and of course, thinking about how that intersects with transport and liquid fuels as well as an important piece of that scenario planning.
Okay, great. Well, to our audience, I'm sorry that we didn't really get to all of the questions that were posed, but thanks everyone for participation. This has been quite interesting for me at least, and I hope it's been interesting for everyone else. I would just say, on this topic of the resilience and resilience planning, track 4, there's still another session in track 4, and that's oriented on resilience in the power sector. One other quick comment that I would no one mentioned this, and so I wanted to mention it before we close, which is in the concept of resilience in the grid. Nobody mentioned cybersecurity, but I think this is another threat, if you will. We know, as I mentioned, the pandemic. No one should have been surprised, right? We should have all remembered what Bill Gates told us 5 years ago, and most of us didn't. That's okay. Now we will never forget. But so we do need to plan for resilience. The public health threat is one thing. The cyber threat is something that's I think really new, that is a more difficult thing to grasp, and we are. I think there will be some kind of a follow-up sometime during the next couple of months. We may do some kind of maybe a half-day seminar or a full-day seminar on cybersecurity that would be organized hosted by ADB, and there'll be some announcements about that. The presentations will be available online, and I think the sessions are all being recorded and are going to be available by tomorrow morning. So with that, I'd like to thank our speakers and panelists again, and especially I want to thank David Elzinga, who's also up late at night as I am. And give yourselves a hand, everyone, please. And I hope to see you at ACEF 2021. Thanks very much.
Where?
Thank
Well,
you.